Ophelia came by and just... This adorable thing here, that's Sophie. And I'll show you what I'm planting and where I'm planting it. Now the dahlias really took a beating. Now, the Mexican sunflower. Let's talk about that. Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's been a weekend. On Friday, Tropical Storm Ophelia hit the eastern North Carolina coast, approximately around Morehead City, and started moving north from there. And unfortunately, my garden was right in the path. Now, thankfully, I'm not directly on the coast. I'm actually set back a little bit from the coast, but I'm still close enough to feel the full effects of Ophelia, and that we did. Thankfully, the flooding that we received was just from the rain. Nothing, I didn't have to suffer any effects from storm surge like many other people along the eastern North Carolina coast did. That being said, there was quite a bit of wind damage, and wind damage was probably 10 times worse than any sort of rain or minor flooding that we may have gotten. Wind gusts in my area got up to around, I'd say 60 miles per hour. Maybe a little stronger, maybe a little weaker, but I'd say on average 60 miles per hour, which is enough to do some damage in the garden. Now, if you've been paying attention or you've been watching the channel, about a week prior to that, maybe 2 weeks prior to that roughly, we got hit with another storm system that rolled through. And that storm system damaged the Mexican sunflowers, and it damaged some of the other sunflowers I had growing here in the vegetable garden. And it did a few other minor, it beat up the dahlias. It did a few other things throughout the garden. It wasn't that bad in comparison to Ophelia. Ophelia came by and just hit us, I think, for a longer period of time with stronger winds. It was only, let's say, 3 to 4 hours of really strong winds, but in those 3 to 4 hours, it beat up the garden good. So that's the downside. The upside is fall cleanup. It helps with fall cleanup because now there's no excuses of I'll leave it till tomorrow or the next day. It's okay, the storm has done some damage, let's start doing some cleanup. So let me just briefly mention some of the things that I did have to clean up and what damage that Ophelia did do. So here in the vegetable garden, I was really worried about losing some of the birdhouse gourds, and that actually didn't happen, strangely enough. A few of the birdhouse gourds that were already on dead vines did fall down. I just simply picked them up and put them someplace to rest, and so they can dry out or rot or do whatever it is that they're going to do. Hopefully they dry out and I can make some sort of birdhouses out of them, but normally they dry on the vine. Now they're off the vine. So, but that being said, the sunflowers, I came out right after the storm basically passed, and I wanted to see what kind of condition everything was in. And the sunflowers that were growing here that had gotten bent up and beat up with the prior storm, this time I only lost a couple of the smaller ones. Surprisingly, even with stronger winds than the prior storm, which I think was Idahlia, Ophelia, I was sure that these sunflowers were gone, but the sunflowers, the bigger ones, definitely hung in there. The smaller ones did go over, some of them broke, but that's kind of to be expected. But the bigger, stronger ones, they stayed, and they're looking good right now. Some of the zinnias, the tall zinnias I had down by the pumpkin, I had to turn around and go in, do some clipping and trimming, and I still might have to. We're only a few days out, and a lot of the plants got very droopy from the four inches or so of rain that we got. We didn't get a lot of rain compared to Idahlia. Idahlia, we got approximately 5 inches, if not more. Here with Ophelia, we only got about 4 inches, but it seemed to, I think the ground was already waterlogged or water saturated from Idahlia, and then Ophelia came in and just added that much more water. So a lot of the plants seemed to flop over as if you had overwatered them. And especially with the plants in the ground, anything that was in a raised bed or pot seemed to be okay, but the citrus pots had gotten knocked over. But thankfully, the two lemon trees that did get knocked over, they're fine. The greenhouse suffered no damage whatsoever, thankfully, but the top shade cloth here, which I really should have taken down prior to the storm. Lessons being learned here. It just got kind of blown off to one side, which is not a big deal. I had to fix it, so it's been fixed. Life is good there. Strangely enough, even with 60-mile-per-hour gusts, none of the plants on the potting bench or the plastic folding table I have next to the potting bench blew off or blew over. I was surprised. I was almost sure to come out in the morning and find a table flipped over and a bunch of plants knocked onto the ground, but surprisingly no. The orange tree behind me right here, that was fine, didn't move an inch. Again, the greenhouse was fine. Now, the Mexican sunflower. Let's talk about that. Now, the Mexican sunflower is looking a little sparse. Over here on this side of the gate, unfortunately, the winds had broken off quite a few branches and it just tore the plants up. The Mexican sunflowers were quite heavy with flowers. I had deadheaded them before the storm, but again, 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts, it really beat up the plants, and the plants they hit their peak and they were fading out. But I was hoping to keep them limping along until at least October, November, maybe November, see how far I could eke them out. Unfortunately, Ophelia had other ideas, and it just slapped the Mexican sunflower as hard as it could. Again, could have been worse, could have been hurricane force winds, 100-mile-per-hour winds would have totally wiped it out. What I did was I came in, I made some hard decisions and I started trimming and cutting back, and as you can see, I'm left with just a few stumps. It was sort of heartbreaking, especially once I found quite a few very wet, tired bees that were still clinging to flowers, holding on for dear life throughout the storm. And in fact, actually, if I can remember, there was a picture I took of a butterfly that I had found in my cleanup, and it was just clinging to a branch for its very existence. I felt so bad for it, but hopefully once it dried out and once everything else started drying out, it flew off and started feasting on whatever flowers remained. Thankfully, what survived has a lot of flower buds on, so I'm hoping that over the course of this week and into next, the remaining Mexican sunflowers do start blooming again. The plants are really beat up. I tried to save best what I could. Let's look at the ones down there. If you can tell here, this first one, I had to trim back pretty hard, and I was very tempted on just taking it out entirely. It looks pretty terrible, and the one behind it looks pretty terrible. The last two look okay-ish. But again, seeing all the insects that were still clinging to the Mexican sunflower, waiting for everything to dry out so they could start feeding again, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't rip it out. So, and I already ripped out a few over there, so I just couldn't do it. So I trimmed it back pretty hard, and there's a lot of good foliage on it, and there's a lot of flower buds, which again, I'm hopeful will all start opening up over the next course of the next few days and start blooming again to provide food for the pollinators, the bees, the butterflies, the moths, the hummingbirds, everything else that feeds on these things. Now, as I stated in a previous video, once these are done and gone, I plan on putting boxwoods in to begin growing my boxwood hedge here. But I'm hoping to keep these, even as ugly as they are at this point, until October, maybe November. The longer I can leave them out, the better for the pollinators. There aren't that many flowering plants left in the garden as the year starts ending. So if I can keep the flowers going for the pollinators as long as possible, there you go. Probably worse than the Mexican sunflower, though, if that's to be believed, are the dahlias. Let's look at them. Now, the dahlias really took a beating. Prior to the storm, I had mentioned that I had turned around and walked around and re-staked some of them, tied them up to their stakes better, but what are you going to do against the 60-mile-per-hour wind and you have nice thick foliage? Dahlia stems aren't the strongest in the world, hence the reason they need to be staked. If you're new to growing dahlias, if you've never heard of a dahlia flower, it's a beautiful flower. It comes in a variety of shapes, sizes, colors, etc. But staking them is probably the most important thing that you do when you grow them, because if you don't, they will flop over. Their stems aren't the strongest. Some varieties have stronger stems, some varieties have weaker stems, but even the strongest stems really aren't going to hold up to heavy winds. Anything, I would say, in my experience, anything over 30 miles per hour. Definitely anything over 30 miles per hour. And again, we got hit with 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts and sustained winds probably at least 30 to 40 miles per hour. So it really beat the dahlias up, and I had to come back through. And just looking now, I may have to come back through and do yet more pruning. But I did some pruning on Sunday, and I had to cut some of these back pretty hard, which is kind of upsetting. That's the downside. On the upside, the plants are throwing up new shoots, which is pretty interesting and exciting. I didn't think that this late in the year they would be doing that, but it might have been because of that fertilizing I did later in the summer with, again, the cow manure and the chicken manure mix that I put down. So maybe that's helping the plants just get that extra boost. The other thing that will be helping them over the course of the next month or so is the cooler weather. With the cooler weather, I think that will definitely help these plants out, and they'll be throwing up new stalks with hopefully more flowers that we can enjoy come the fall. But cutting these back yesterday was just heartbreaking. But the garden grows and everything keeps moving forward. So some cleanup was done. Some of the Mexican sunflowers were removed. They were going to have to be removed anyways. You have to look at things in a positive light. Surprisingly, a lot of the rest of the garden did fairly well. Minor damage to some plants here and there. Other plants were already ready to come out, and some of the plants are still recovering again from that water-sodden ground. But I'm hoping that over the course of the next week, they really start bouncing back. We will see, and we will move on. Now I'm going to take the opportunity to turn around and plant something I've been wanting to plant for a while, but it's just been too hot. But now with cooler temperatures, and especially with the ground being sopping wet, I think now's a good time to plant what I want to plant. So let me go grab it, and I'll show you what I'm planting and where I'm planting it. So right here, just past the rose garden, I'm going to be planting a sweet bay magnolia. Now I have one here in a pot, and it started growing through the pot, which is probably why it started putting on all this new growth. I'm going to plant it today, and what I'm hoping is I can get this to grow up into a tree form over the course of the next 5, 10, 20 years. And it's going to form part of the entrance to the new shade garden, which is right here, which there's nothing to look at right now because it's just grass. But hopefully in the next 5 years or so, I can start that project once I complete more of the rose garden and a bunch of other projects that I'm working on. But this one tree, this sweet bay magnolia, will form again the beginnings of the entrance to the shade garden. I plan on getting another one from Arbor Day Foundation. I think I can get it for like, I don't know, 10, 15 bucks. Not that expensive for a bare root. I'll order it from Arbor Day Foundation. I'll put it in a pot, and then probably next spring or next fall, I'll plant it out here to be opposite of the one that I'm planting here today. And again, that'll form the entrance. Now, if you'd seen my recent short about the inkberry hollies, I plan on using those as hedging screen between the grand walkway and the shade garden. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, you can head over to growinggreenfinger.com, the garden, and I have some maps there which I update yearly as to the different spaces that I'm talking about or working in, so you can kind of see where it is in the garden that I'm working. Let me quit prattling, plant this up real quick. So this is planted now, and that's one more plant off my needs to be planted checklist. I have a bunch of other plants that still need to be planted, and I'll be purchasing more in the upcoming weeks for fall planting, winter planting, that kind of thing. So for instance, if I get a good sized sweet bay magnolia bare root, I could probably plant it this December, January, as long as we're not having super cold spells. I have planted shrubs here in January and February. The first year I was down here, 2021, I planted a bunch of shrubs and had no problems because, again, growing zone 8A generally were warmer than normal. But I'll have to watch the weather. If it looks like we're going to have some really cold weather, it'll go into a bare root. I'll put the bare root plant or plants into pots, and they'll go into the greenhouse for the winter, and I'll plant them out in the late winter, early spring. You know what I'm talking about. So, Ophelia beat up the garden a bit, but the garden survives. It will continue to go on. Fall cleanup was pushed ahead by a few weeks in some instances because of Ophelia, but that's okay. It was going to have to happen anyways. And I think that's the way you have to look at gardening a lot of times, is that, yes, something bad may happen, but we can take a positive spin from it, or something positive can come from it. Heaven forbid it was a Cat 2 or Cat 3 or higher hurricane and it pretty much wiped everything flat on the ground. I have a lot of compost material. That's the way you have to look at it. You have to, yes, it sucks that you've lost all those plants and maybe some trees and that kind of thing, but then you have to find the positive in it. You don't have to. I mean, you could be negative, but I prefer to find the positive in these things. And I would look at it as I have now a lot of compost material. And today, due to the weather cooling off and the ground being wet, I was able to plant a new tree. And again, I have a lot more to plant out over the next few weeks / months. There's more fall cleanup to be done. There's fall crops that I need to start getting planted. Tomorrow I got to make a run to my local nursery to get more raised bed mix. And the rose garden, I have to get back into that soon because, again, cooling temperatures, and I want to wrap up part of that project that I've been working on, or trying to work on more consistently this year. So there's a lot going on in the garden. There's going to be a lot more going on in the garden throughout the fall into the winter because the show doesn't end here. My name is Jason. I'm in Growing Zone 8A. This adorable thing here, that's Sophie. And we're going to catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.